Paris, 1893. The city was alive in a way no one had seen before. Gas lamps glowed like tiny stars along the boulevards. Carriages rattled on cobblestone streets, and cafe doors swung open to waves of laughter, music, and conversation. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted through the cold evening air, mixing with the sharp scent of tobacco. But there was something else in the air, something green, mysterious, and intoxicating. It was the scent of absinthe, the drink they called La Fée Verte, the green fairy. People whispered about it like a forbidden secret, yet it was everywhere. In the smoky cafés of Montmartre, in the elegant salons where poets argued about love and death, in the hidden corners where painters sketched by candlelight. It was there, in their glasses, glowing like emerald fire. Absinthe wasn't just a drink. It was a ritual, an escape, a doorway into a world that felt almost magical. Or so they believed. For some, it was the key to inspiration. The painters swore it opened their eyes to colors no one else could see. Writers claimed it loosened their thoughts and gave birth to ideas that danced like flames in their minds. Musicians said it let them hear sounds hidden in the silence. But for others, it was something darker, a poison, a madness that could twist the mind and break the soul. Doctors warned about hallucinations, convulsions, even death. They called it dangerous, addictive, corrupting. But no one in Paris seemed to care. Every evening, as the sun sank behind the roofs, the cafes filled with voices and glasses clinked in a strange harmony. It became a ritual they called l'heure verte, the green hour. Men in crisp suits and women in velvet gowns would gather, waiting for the slow drip of water through sugar cubes, watching the green liquid bloom into a milky haze in their glasses. The first sip was always the same, sharp, bitter, like biting into a secret you were never meant to know. And then came the warmth, the soft dizziness, the feeling that the world was bending, shifting, becoming more beautiful and more dangerous all at once. But behind the laughter, behind the art and the poetry, something else was happening, something no one wanted to admit. People were changing. Some began to lose themselves in it. They stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped painting or writing unless they had that glass glowing before them. Friends whispered about strange dreams, about shadows that moved in corners, about whispers in the night that no one else could hear. And sometimes someone would vanish, a familiar face, a friend who used to sit at the corner table, now gone without a word. They said absinthe could take your soul if you weren't careful. Most laughed at that, but not everyone. In a little cafe on Rue de Martyrs, a man sat alone at a round wooden table, staring into his glass like it held all the answers to the universe. His name was Julien Moreau, a painter, though his canvases had not sold in months. Once, he was full of color and life, but now his hands trembled when he held a brush. He came here every evening at the same hour, ordered the same drink, and waited for the world to blur just enough to forget the things he could not fix. Tonight, though, something was different. Tonight, the green fairy seemed to whisper louder than ever. Across the room, two men were arguing in hushed voices. One was a poet, the other a critic. They spoke about a new law being debated, something about banning absinthe, calling it a drink for lunatics. The critic slammed his fist on the table. "They cannot ban art," he hissed. "And absinthe is art. Without it, half of Paris would be silent." The poet only smiled, his teeth pale against the green glow of his glass. "Art does not need permission," he said softly. "It only needs courage." Then he looked at Julien and nodded, as if inviting him into a secret he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Outside, the wind swept through Montmartre, carrying with it the sound of distant music and the smell of damp stone. The streets shimmered under the weak light of the lamps, and in the distance, the shadow of the Sacré-Cœur loomed like a silent guardian. But even the great church seemed powerless against what was coming. Paris was spinning toward something no one could stop. A fever, a hunger, a dream that tasted like anise and burned like fire. Julien raised his glass and let the liquid touch his lips. For a moment, everything slowed, the noise, the smoke, the laughter. He felt it slide down his throat, cold and warm all at once. And then the world tilted, just a little. The colors on the walls seemed brighter, the faces sharper, the shadows deeper. He closed his eyes and thought he heard a woman's voice, soft and strange, saying something he couldn't quite understand. When he opened them again, the poet was gone. So was the critic, and the cafe was quiet, too quiet, as if time itself had paused to listen. Julian looked around. The room was empty now, except for him and the bartender wiping a glass with slow, careful movements. "Where did they go?" Julian asked. The bartender didn't answer. He only glanced at Julian with eyes that seemed older than stone and said, "Drink your absinthe, monsieur. It's the green hour." Then he turned away. Julian stared at his glass. The liquid swirled in circles, glowing faintly as if something inside it was alive. He leaned closer, and for the briefest second, he thought he saw a face reflected in the green, a woman with eyes like shattered glass, smiling at him in a way that made his blood turn cold. He blinked, and she was gone. Outside, a clock struck 6, and the sound rolled through the streets like a warning no one wanted to hear. Somewhere in the distance, laughter broke, sharp and sudden, then faded into silence. Julian pushed the glass away, but it didn't matter. The taste was already on his tongue, and the voice in his head was whispering again, louder this time, promising him beauty, promising him madness. And that was how it began, the night the Green Fairy came for Julian Moreau. But what happened after that? Paris would never forget. Julian sat still for a long while, his fingers tracing the rim of the glass, as if it might reveal the secrets hidden in its depths. The cafe around him began to stir again, chairs scraping softly against the floor, muted conversations returning like a river, finding its path again. Yet, something felt different now. The air had a weight to it, a thickness that pressed against his chest. People came and went, faces he half recognized, yet they all seemed distant, as if a thin sheet of glass now separated him from them. The door opened with a soft creak, and a gust of cold air slipped in. A young woman entered, her hair dark and loose beneath a small felt hat. She looked around, scanning the room with a searching gaze before choosing a seat not far from Julian. Her coat was simple, a deep navy wool with worn edges, but her posture carried a kind of quiet determination. The waiter approached, and she ordered an absinthe without hesitation. Julian watched her ritual closely, the sugar cube placed delicately on the spoon, the slow drip of water turning the liquid cloudy, the first careful sip that made her lips press together. She caught him watching and offered a faint smile. "It helps with the cold," she said, her voice low but steady. He nodded, unsure whether to answer. "Or makes you forget it exists," he murmured. She tilted her head. Maybe that's the same thing. They said little more for a while. The cafe had its own rhythm, waiters weaving through narrow spaces, a pianist in the corner testing a few soft notes, the quiet hum of the street just beyond the door. Yet, there was a question that lingered in Julian's mind. Why did she come here alone? And why did she drink like someone who had been here before? Finally, she leaned toward him, resting her elbow on the table. "Do you paint?" Julian blinked. "Yes. I used to. How did you know?" Her smile deepened slightly. "You have a hands for it. Always moving, even when you think they're still. And the eyes. You look at everything like it might disappear." He didn't know what to say. No one had spoken to him that way in months. "And you?" he asked. "What do you do?" She hesitated, then looked at her glass as if it might offer an answer. "I write," she said finally. "Not for the papers. Just for myself. Words are like paint, only thinner. They slip between cracks." The conversation hung there, simple and unhurried, like smoke curling toward the ceiling. They exchanged names. Hers was Claire, and for a brief moment, the city outside seemed far away. Yet, as they spoke, Julian noticed something odd. Her hands trembled ever so slightly when she reached for her glass. And there was a shadow in her eyes, the kind of tiredness that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something heavy and unspoken. He almost asked her about it, but the clock above the bar struck the half hour, and with it came a strange hush. Conversations faltered, chairs stilled, and every glass in a room seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. It was a trick of the gas lamps, perhaps, or the way the smoke caught the air. But to Julian, it felt like something was watching them all, breathing through the walls. Claire noticed it too. She leaned closer. "Do you ever feel it?" she whispered. Julian frowned. "Feel what?" "The pull," she said. "The way it makes you come back. No matter how many nights you swear it's the last." Her words lingered like a challenge. He wanted to deny them, to laugh and shake his head. But he couldn't, because he had felt it, that quiet, invisible thread that pulled him back to this place, to this drink, night after night. The door opened again, and this time a man stepped in wearing a heavy coat and a scarf pulled high against the cold. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes sharp, calculating. Then he walked straight to the bar, asked for a glass, and slipped a coin onto the counter. The bartender poured without question. Julian had seen him before, somewhere in Montmartre. A journalist, perhaps, or a doctor, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. Tonight, though, there was a tension in his shoulders as he sipped, his gaze flicking toward the street outside, as if he expected someone, or something, to follow him in. Claire followed his glance. "Do you see them too?" she asked suddenly. Julian turned to her. "Ooh," but she didn't answer. She only sipped her absinthe, her lips pale against the green rim of the glass, and for a moment, Julian thought he saw that same reflection again, a flicker of something that wasn't quite her staring back. The night stretched on. Outside, the lamps dimmed as a thin fog crept along the streets. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 7, and the sound echoed strangely in the quiet. The man at the bar finished his drink and left without a word. Claire stayed a little longer, tracing patterns on the table with her fingertip, lost in thought. When she finally rose to leave, she looked at Julian and said, "Be careful with your colors. Sometimes the green fairy doesn't give them back." Then she was gone, swallowed by the fog outside. Julian sat alone once more, the taste of anise still on his tongue, the whisper in his mind a little louder than before. He wondered if he should leave too, go home, forget the cafe, forget the drink. But his feet felt heavy, as if the wooden floorboards had grown roots around them. He ordered another glass. This time, as the water dripped slowly over the sugar, he thought about the stories he had heard, of painters who vanished, of poets who wrote their last words on cafe napkins and were never seen again, of lovers who walked into the night and simply didn't return. They said absinthe made the world beautiful, but they never said what it took in exchange. The bartender set the glass down gently. "It's a cold night," he said. "Best to stay inside." Julian nodded, though he wasn't sure why. Outside, the wind howled softly and the lamps flickered. The city went on as it always did, crowded, restless, full of life, but somewhere in its heart, something green and unseen waited, calling to those who would listen. And Julian, whether he knew it or not, had already begun to listen. The night deepened, and with it came the sounds of a city that rarely slept. Somewhere beyond the fog, a carriage wheel cracked against the cobblestones, followed by the faint, uneven rhythm of hooves. In the narrow lanes of Montmartre, shopkeepers shuttered their doors one by one, leaving only the cafés lit, their warm glow spilling across the wet streets. The cafés were the heartbeats of Paris in those days. More than places to drink, they were meeting grounds, confessionals, stages for every dreamer, schemer, and lost soul who wandered in. Julian watched the glass in front of him as though it might offer a kind of truth he could not find elsewhere. The sugar had long dissolved, leaving the drink pale and ghostly, its green now turned cloudy and soft. Each sip seemed to blur the edges of the room a little more until the walls themselves appeared to lean closer, listening. A man at a nearby table began to hum, a tune Julian did not recognize, low and winding, almost like a lullaby. He was an older fellow, his coat patched at the elbows, his hair thin as paper. In front of him lay a small notebook, its pages filled with what looked like unfinished lines of poetry. His hand trembled as he reached for his glass, and when he noticed Julian's glance, he smiled weakly. "First time?" the old man asked. Julian hesitated. "Not quite," he said, "but it feels different tonight." The man chuckled, a dry sound. It always does, the night you start to notice. Notice what? The old man didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back and closed his eyes as if listening to a distant sound only he could hear. Julian turned his gaze back to the street. Through the window pane, the fog had thickened, swallowing the outlines of the lamps. For a brief moment, the world outside looked like a painting half-finished, its colors washed in gray. Somewhere a church bell tolled, and then, as if the city itself were drawing breath, the door opened again. A group entered this time, 2 young men and a woman, their clothes marked by paint stains and charcoal smudges. They carried a rolled canvas under one arm, their laughter loud and careless, the kind that comes easily after midnight. They greeted the bartender by name and ordered 3 glasses. Julian recognized one of them, a sculptor he had met once at a gallery opening, back when his own hands were steady and his work still sold. The sculptor caught Julian's eye and grinned. "Moreau, I thought you left Paris." "I tried," Julian said quietly. The woman with them, a painter with bright red ribbons in her hair, slid into a chair nearby. "No one leaves Paris," she said, her voice carrying a hint of something that was neither joy nor sadness, but a mix of both. "It holds you, like the fog." They laughed, and soon their conversation spilled into talk of commissions, unpaid debts, the latest scandal at the theater, the price of pigments. Julian listened in silence, his fingers tightening around his glass. Each word felt distant, as though it floated on the surface of the drink rather than through the air. It was then that the talk shifted to absinthe itself. "They're saying the council might ban it," the sculptor said, shaking his head. "Too many accidents. Too many disappearances." "Disappearances?" the woman scoffed. "People drink too much wine and fall in the river all the time. Do they ban wine?" The second man, a sketch artist with ink-stained sleeves, leaned forward. "It's not the same," he said quietly. "Wine doesn't make you see things that aren't there. Last month, I saw a man staring at the wall for an hour, whispering to someone only he could see. Perhaps he saw the truth," the woman replied. "And perhaps you were too afraid to look." Their words lingered like smoke in the room. Julian said nothing, but a cold thread of unease wound itself tighter in his chest. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, thick as wool now. The lamps beyond were no more than faint halos, and the street seemed to narrow, as though it too were drawing in closer to listen. The old poet stirred from his chair, gathered his notebook, and limped toward the door. As he passed, he leaned toward Julian and murmured, "When the fairy calls your name, don't answer. Not with your voice. Not with your heart." Julian turned to ask him what he meant, but the door had already shut behind him. The cafe seemed smaller now, the air heavier. Julian thought of Claire's words, "Be careful with your colors." He wondered if she too had felt this growing pull, this invisible thread that seemed to lead from one glass to the next, from one night to the next, until the nights became a blur and the city outside faded into shadow. He finished his drink and pushed the glass away. The bartender glanced at him, but said nothing. For a moment, he considered leaving. He imagined the cold air on his face, the long walk back to his attic room with its cracked ceiling and blank canvases waiting in the dark. But when he stood, his legs felt unsteady, and the fog beyond the door seemed to press harder against the glass, as if warning him not to step outside. So he sat again. The painter with the red ribbons lit a cigarette and exhaled a thin curl of smoke. "Do you ever wonder," she said suddenly, "why it tastes like this? Why it feels like this? As if something is watching you from the bottom of the glass." Her companions laughed uneasily, but Julian did not, because that was exactly what he felt. The clock on the wall ticked past 8, its hands moving with a slow, almost reluctant sweep. Outside, the night deepened further, and the fog did not lift. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistled, its sound carried low across the Seine. And in that moment, Julian realized the green hour was far from over. It was only just beginning. The streets outside the café had emptied further, leaving only the faint echo of a lone carriage somewhere down the hill. In Montmartre, nights could stretch like old canvas, thin and worn in places, torn open in others. The café's warmth was a fragile shelter against it, but even here, the cold seemed to seep in through the floorboards, pooling at people's feet like invisible water. Julian leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, letting the murmurs of conversation wash over him. The painters had grown louder, their talk spilling into arguments about light and shadow, about who had stolen whose technique, about which gallery might still accept their work. The red-ribbon woman flicked ash into a saucer and laughed at something that wasn't meant to be funny. A waiter passed by with a tray of fresh glasses, the sugar cubes already balanced on their spoons. The ritual repeated, slow and precise. The ice-cold water dripping in delicate streams, the green liquid turning pale, the soft clink of glass against wood. There was something hypnotic in it, as if the drink itself demanded to be prepared with a certain reverence. Julian's thoughts wandered to the stories he had heard outside the cafe. Just last week, a neighbor had told him about a clerk who collapsed in the street after his fourth glass. Some said it was his heart. Others swore he had seen something in the fog that no man should see. There were pamphlets now, passed out by doctors and moralists alike, warning that absinthe was not just a drink, but a sickness. They claimed it caused madness, that it burned the nerves and hollowed the mind. Yet, every evening the cafes filled. Every evening, someone new sat down with that same look in their eyes, the look Julian now caught in his own reflection on the window pane. The door creaked open again, letting in another wisp of night air. This time, it was a man in his 40s with a weathered coat and a cane he didn't seem to need. He paused just inside the doorway, surveying the room like a man arriving late to a play he had seen many times before. When his gaze fell on Julian, he nodded faintly and made his way over. "May I?" the man asked, gesturing to the empty chair. Julian shrugged. "If you like." The man sat, rested his cane against the table, and ordered without looking at the menu. His face was marked by fine lines that deepened when he smiled, but his eyes were sharp, quick, like someone accustomed to measuring a room before speaking. "You're a painter," he said after a moment. Julian stiffened. "Is it written on my forehead?" The man chuckled softly. "No, it's in the way you look at things. The way your hands twitch when you think no one is watching. Paris is full of painters. Full of ghosts, too." Julian frowned at that. Ghosts? The man's eyes lingered on his own glass, watching the way the sugar slowly dissolved. Not the kind you see in mirrors. The kind you carry with you. The ones this drink calls back when you least expect it. Julian wasn't sure if the man was teasing him or warning him. "And you? Are you a ghost?" "Not yet," the man said simply, and took his first sip. The conversation might have ended there, but the man spoke again, his tone lower now. "I've seen what it does to men like you. First it gives you the colors. Brighter, sharper, sweeter than life. Then it takes them away one by one, until even the sun feels pale." Julian forced a laugh. "You sound like one of those pamphlets they hand out near the stations." "Perhaps," the man said, "but pamphlets don't remember your name." Julian turned sharply at that, but the man only smiled and tapped his temple. "I remember faces, names, places. You showed a painting once, near Place Pigalle. A woman by a window. I bought the ticket to see it." Julian looked down at his empty glass, his throat dry. "That was a long time ago." "Yes," the man said. "It always starts a long time ago." Outside, the fog thickened until the lamps disappeared entirely, their glow swallowed by the dark. A sudden gust rattled the windows, and the piano in the corner gave a single, thin note as though struck by an invisible hand. The conversation in the room faltered for a heartbeat before rising again. Julian found himself staring at the man's drink as the water dripped, steady and patient. The green clouded, shifted, turned the color of faded jade. The man raised the glass in a silent toast. "To Paris," he said, "and to those who think they can outdrink the city." Julian didn't answer. The hours slid on. One by one, the tables emptied until only a few figures remained, their faces pale in the gaslight. The sculptor and his friends left, their laughter spilling out into the street before the door closed behind them. The man with the cane stayed a while longer, then finally rose, leaving a few coins beneath his glass. As he passed, he paused. "If you keep painting," he said quietly, "lock the windows. She doesn't like to be painted." And then he was gone, leaving Julian alone once more. The bartender polished the counter with a slow, circular motion. He looked at Julian as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. Julian stared at the empty chair across from him, the faint mark left by the cane on the floor, the ghostly ring of condensation where the glass had been. His mind felt heavy, but his fingers itched for a brush for the first time in weeks. Colors swam behind his eyelids when he closed them. Deep greens, pale whites, the faint shimmer of something not entirely of this world. He rose at last, leaving the cafe and stepping into the night. The fog closed around him like a curtain, soft and damp, carrying the smell of coal smoke and distant rain. Somewhere above, the Sacred Cur stood in silence, its white stone darkened by the mist. As he walked, he heard footsteps that were not his own. He turned. The street was empty. Only the echo remained. Julian quickened his pace, his coat pulled tight against the cold. The city felt different now, less alive, more watchful. Windows blinked like half-lidded eyes, doors stood ajar as if listening. The green hour had passed, but its shadow clung to the streets like a stain that would not wash away. When he reached his narrow building, he paused at the door. The footsteps had stopped. He fumbled for his key, glancing once more over his shoulder. The street was still, silent except for the faint hiss of a gas lamp guttering nearby. And then, just before he stepped inside, he thought he heard it again, that soft, strange voice, the one he had heard in the cafe. Only this time, it spoke his name. Julian's room was small, a single window facing the street and a narrow bed pressed against the wall. The paint-stained easel leaned in the corner like an old friend that no longer spoke. Canvases, half-finished and dust-covered, lined the floor, their colors dulled by time and neglect. He struck a match, lit the lamp, and watched the flame bloom into a soft glow. The city beyond the glass was a blur of pale shapes in the fog. He could still hear faint laughter from a distant street, but it felt far away now, like an echo from another life. The voice from earlier lingered in his mind, whispering, soft, almost kind, yet carrying something sharp beneath it. Julian set his coat aside and sat before the easel. His hands hovered over the brushes, then drew back. He had not painted in weeks. Every time he tried, the colors fled from his mind like frightened birds. But tonight something stirred. The memory of the cafe, the glow of the glass, the pale green turning cloudy in the lamplight. It clung to him, pulling at his fingers. He dipped a brush in the thinnest wash of green and let it move across the canvas. The bristles dragged softly, leaving a faint, uneven line. He added white, then a trace of black, then another stroke, slow, searching. A shape began to form. A face, perhaps, or the suggestion of one. He couldn't tell yet. As he worked, the room seemed to shift. The lamplight flickered without a draft. The sound of the street dulled, as though thick curtains had been drawn over the night. The brush moved more easily now, and with every stroke, the face became clearer. It was a woman's. Her eyes were the first thing he saw, wide, dark, and glinting with something that felt neither kind nor cruel, only knowing. Her lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but something close. Around her, the green bled outward, curling like smoke, softening the edges of the world. Julian set the brush down and stepped back. The face on the canvas looked back at him. He had never seen her before, yet she seemed familiar in the way a half-remembered dream does, close enough to stir the heart, distant enough to unsettle it. A knock startled him. 3 soft raps against the door. He turned, but the corridor outside was empty when he opened it. Only the thin fog crept in through the stairwell, bringing the cold with it. Julian shut the door and locked it. The clock on the wall marked the passing minutes. Midnight crept closer. The city beyond the glass settled into a hush, broken only by the hiss of the gas lamp outside and the occasional call of a late-night vendor pulling his cart home. Julian poured a small glass of water and sat on the edge of the bed. His eyes kept drifting back to the painting. The woman's gaze followed him across the room, calm, steady, almost expectant. He thought of the people in the cafe, the poet, the sculptor, Claire with her trembling hands, the man with the cane who spoke as though he knew too much. Were they all haunted by something like this? Or had he simply drunk too much? Sleep came slowly, in fragments. He dreamt of streets that wound endlessly in circles, of lamps that flickered green instead of gold, of a river that ran not with water, but with some pale, shimmering light. In the dream, the woman from the painting stood by the riverbank, her dress billowing like smoke. She raised a hand to him, beckoning, and when he tried to step closer, the ground beneath him softened like wet paint. Julian woke before dawn, his heart racing. The lamp had gone out. The window was a square of gray, the fog outside still clinging to the rooftops. The painting was where he had left it. Only now, the colors seemed different, richer, darker. The green had deepened overnight, spreading into places he was sure he had left blank. Her eyes were brighter, as if the paint itself had caught a spark. Julian backed away, his shoulder brushing the cold wall. A sound rose faintly from the street below, the clatter of milk carts, the bark of a vendor opening his shutters. Paris was waking, as it always did. He dressed quickly, splashed water on his face, and stepped out into the damp morning. The air smelled of coal and bread and something faintly metallic. The fog had not lifted. It swirled low over the cobblestones, curling between the boots of workers and the skirts of women carrying baskets to market. Julian walked without aim, past the bakery where the windows steamed with the first loaves of the day, past the newspaper stand where fresh headlines spoke of politics and rising prices, past a policeman lighting his pipe, the smoke trailing pale in the cold. Everywhere, people moved with the same quiet purpose they always had. And yet, as he looked closer, he noticed the glasses on the tables of early cafés, the faint green tinge clinging even to the morning air. It was not just a drink anymore. It was a part of Paris. Near the Place Pigalle, a group of artists had already gathered, their sketchbooks open despite the hour. One of them waved Julian over, a tall man with a crooked hat and a grin that rarely reached his eyes. "Moreau," the man called. "Where have you been hiding? Come, join us. We were just saying, the green hour is stretching these days. Morning, night, what's the difference?" Julian forced a thin smile and shook his head. "Not today." The man raised his glass in mock salute. "Suit yourself, but always calls you back." Julian kept walking. The city around him was waking, but he felt as though he were drifting through a painting, each sound slightly muffled, each color a shade off from what it should be. The woman's face lingered behind his eyes. The whisper, too, though he couldn't make out the words anymore. When he reached the edge of Montmartre, he paused, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. The sun was struggling to break through the fog, sending thin bands of light across the roofs. Somewhere below, the Seine glimmered faintly, a cold mirror to the sky. Julian turned back toward the hill. He should eat something, he thought. He should rest. But his steps turned of their own accord, carrying him back toward the cafe, back toward the green. As the days turned into weeks, the streets of Paris seemed to breathe with a life of their own. The rattle of carriage wheels mixed with the chatter of people strolling along the boulevards, their voices rising and falling like the notes of a waltz. Beneath the surface, though, there was something different, something that everyone felt but no one quite named aloud. It was as though a quiet obsession had taken hold of the city. Every cafe seemed to have its own ritual, its own way of preparing the green drink that was now whispered about as much as it was celebrated. Absinthe was no longer just a choice on the menu. It was becoming a statement, a symbol of taste, freedom, and perhaps even rebellion. Clara often found herself caught between fascination and unease. She had been in Paris only a few years, but already she had seen how quickly the tide of fashion could sweep through its streets. She remembered when coffee was all anyone spoke of, when cafe tables overflowed with strong black cups and the smell of roasted beans. Now, it was the green swirl of absinthe that colored conversations. She would stand by the window of her small apartment, watching the glow of gas lamps flicker on as evening descended, and wonder how something so bitter could become the darling of poets and painters alike. Her brother, Henri, had warned her about the drink. He said it made the mind wander too far, that it could open doors people were not ready to step through. Yet she could not help but be curious. Everyone seemed to be chasing something in that pale green glass. Inspiration, escape, or maybe just a way to forget. Henri, on the other hand, was not so easily swayed by fashion. A printer by trade, he worked long hours with ink-stained fingers, folding broadsheets that carried the latest gossip and the boldest headlines. Each day he read the articles about absinthe with a growing sense of concern. There were whispers of strange happenings, artists painting through the night without sleep, men losing themselves in the fog of their thoughts, women laughing too loudly and too long at things that were never quite funny. The papers called it the Green Muse, but Henri wondered if it was more of a shadow than a muse. He kept his worries to himself most of the time, but every now and then he would slip a word of caution into his letters to Clara, telling her to keep her distance from certain cafés, certain circles of friends. The city, however, was not built on caution. It thrived on wonder and risk, and the 1890s were a time when everything felt possible. The Eiffel Tower, once called a monstrosity by critics, now stood proudly over the city, its iron lace glinting in the afternoon sun. Painters filled their studios with daring colors. Writers crowded the smoky back rooms of cafés, and the air buzzed with talk of invention, progress, and the future. Absinthe seemed to fit perfectly into this moment, a drink that promised to free the mind and dissolve the edges of the ordinary world. Some said it was just strong liquor with a hint of anise and herbs, but others believed it held a secret, something ancient and almost mystical that no one could quite explain. One evening, Clara found herself invited to a gathering at a small café near Montmartre. The café was known for its crowd of artists and writers, the sort of people who stayed until dawn, arguing about colors, shapes, and the meaning of life. The room was warm and crowded when she arrived, the smell of roasted chestnuts mingling with the faint bitterness of wormwood in the air. She noticed how each table seemed to glow faintly green under the lamps, as though the drink itself had become a part of the light. A man with a pointed beard poured water slowly over a sugar cube, watching as the clear liquid turned cloudy in his glass. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat whispered to a painter about the vision she had seen after her second drink. Clara sat quietly, her fingers tracing the rim of her empty glass, trying to decide if this was just another evening in Paris or the start of something she might not fully understand. Outside, Henri lingered in the shadows, waiting for her to emerge. He had passed by the café on his way home from the press and felt a pang of worry when he saw her familiar figure through the window. He knew these places too well, not for their beauty, but for the stories that sometimes followed. He thought of the young men who had lost their wages and their wits after too many late nights, of the poems that started with promise and ended with silence. Yet he also knew he could not stop her from stepping into that world. Paris had a way of drawing people in, of making them believe they could dance along the edge without ever falling. As the night deepened, the city seemed to hush, but the café only grew louder. Laughter spilled into the streets, the kind that rose high and sharp before fading into murmurs. Clara left with her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, her mind spinning with half-heard stories and half-seen glances. Henri caught up to her at the corner, his voice low and steady as he asked if she was all right. She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the glow behind them, the green that seemed to follow her even after the door had closed. What neither of them knew was that the craze had only just begun. In the weeks that followed, more cafés began to serve the drink in elaborate rituals. More artists praised it as the secret to their greatest work, and more whispers filled the streets about what it did to the mind. There were rumors of sudden tempers, of strange dreams that felt too real, of a restlessness that made even the calmest soul stir at night. Henri clipped each story from the papers, folding them into a neat stack he kept beneath his desk. Clara, meanwhile, found herself invited to more gatherings, each one promising a glimpse into the world of the extraordinary. And so, the city moved forward as it always did, with one foot in the light and one in the shadows. The Absinthe Craze was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming a habit, a heartbeat, a quiet tide that touched everyone whether they drank it or not. There was talk among the merchants about shortages of the herb, about rising prices, about fortunes being made in the green liquid that filled so many glasses. There was also talk, quieter still, about the cost that did not show on the bill. The sleepless nights, the strained friendships, the hands that trembled even when the glass was empty. By the turn of the season, Paris had become a city where every story seemed to have a green thread running through it. Lovers met over it, writers cursed it, and musicians claimed it gave them the notes they could never find before. Yet, for all its presence, there was something about it that remained just out of reach, like a shadow in the corner of the room that never quite matched the light. Clara felt it when she walked home alone, the streets whispering with the memory of laughter. Henri felt it when he read the latest article about another painter gone mad, another poet lost in his own lines. And somewhere, beyond their sight, something was beginning to stir. A voice in the papers, a name spoken too often in certain circles, a question asked one night and never fully answered. It was as though the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something that might reveal whether this green muse was truly a friend to Paris, or a guest who would not know when to leave. The days moved slowly as autumn thickened its presence over Paris, yet the talk of absinthe only seemed to grow louder. Newspapers ran little stories about its rise in the cafés, some praising it as a drink of the artists and thinkers, others whispering about the dark toll it might take on the body and the mind. For people like Pierre and Luc, it was not just a drink. It was part of their routine, a ritual that marked the passage of time in a city that never really stood still. Margot watched it all from her corner in the cafe, her eyes catching the fleeting moments, the laughter that turned to arguments, the bright eyes that dulled as the evenings grew long. There was something in the air that unsettled her, but she could not quite name it. By the river, the factories kept churning, and the smell of bitter herbs sometimes mingled with the mist rising from the water. It was said that the distilleries outside the city worked day and night to meet the demand. Farmers had started growing more wormwood in the fields nearby, its sharp, silver leaves catching the light of the early morning frost. The market sellers mention it with a mix of pride and worry. More demand meant more income, yes, but also more talk about how the authorities were starting to watch closely. Regulations were being whispered about, but no one yet knew what form they might take. Some said it was only a matter of time before the city cracked down on the drink that had so quickly become its signature. In the cafés, the characters of this story began to feel the changes more deeply. Henri, a quiet painter who had been living in a small attic room above the cobbled streets, had found his work slowing down. Once, the colors came easily to him, soft greens and golds that reflected the glow of the city at dusk. Now, he found himself staring at blank canvases, the green glass on his table always just half empty. He told himself the drink helped him think, that it opened his imagination. But in the stillness of early morning, when the streets were yet empty, he wondered if it was something else entirely, something that kept him in that suspended moment between dream and wakefulness, never quite stepping forward. Across town, a young seamstress named Elise noticed her brother had started spending more evenings at the cafe than at home. He was a carpenter by trade, and his hands bore the marks of steady work, but lately, the wood lay untouched on his bench as the nights stretched late into the cold hours. She heard him talk about the drink, as though it were a muse, a promise that life could be more than long days and tired eyes. But Elise, sharp and steady, could see the restless way he rubbed his temples, how his fingers sometimes trembled as he buttoned his coat in the morning. She began to wonder if the green haze in the glass was reaching further than the cafe walls. The city itself seemed to mirror this strange duality, beauty in the light, something restless in the shadows. Posters advertising the drink were pasted near the theaters, bright green illustrations of dancing fairies and soft-faced muses, a promising inspiration. But just around the corner, under the gas lamps, small groups muttered about accidents in the streets, about men who once sang at the cafe now sitting silent with far-off eyes. It was not yet called a problem. It was still a fashion, a craze, a curiosity that the world beyond Paris was beginning to notice. But the air was thick with the kind of anticipation that hangs before a storm. One chilly night, Luc and Pierre sat once more at their usual table. The café was louder than usual, filled with the warmth of wet coats and the hum of conversation. Pierre leaned close and whispered of a man who had come to Paris from the south, claiming to have a recipe that made the drink sharper, its effects more vivid. Luc laughed, shaking his head, but he noticed how the man at the next table, a stranger with a long coat and dark hair, lifted his eyes for just a moment, as though the word itself had called him to attention. The moment passed quickly, but Luc felt a chill run along his spine, the kind of feeling that comes when something unseen shifts in the room. Outside, the Seine reflected the city lights like a sheet of rippling glass. Boats moved slowly under the bridges, carrying barrels and crates, some marked with familiar labels, others bearing no names at all. There were rumors that not all the bottles came from the distilleries people knew. Some came from hidden rooms and basements, from back alleys where the recipes were stronger, less careful, their effects unpredictable. Henri had heard of one such place, a little door behind a bookshop where the air smelled of fennel and something bitterer still. He had not gone there, not yet, but he wondered if he would, if his hands kept shaking and his canvas stayed bare. For Margot, the nights stretched longer too. She found herself wiping down the tables more slowly, her ears catching pieces of conversations that seemed to repeat from table to table. It was as though the whole city were caught in a rhythm, a slow pull toward something they could not name, but felt in the pit of their stomachs. Once, she asked the cafe owner if he thought it was getting out of hand. He only shrugged, said the city had seen crazes before, that this too would pass. But Margot noticed the way his eyes flicked to the shelves lined with green bottles before he spoke, and how his fingers lingered on the coin box just a little too long. By late November, the mornings were coated in frost, and the river carried the breath of winter. Yet the cafe stayed full. There was a sense of waiting in the air, as though everyone knew something was about to happen, something that might either make the drink a legend forever or bring it all crashing down. The artists spoke of it as their lifeblood, the workers called it their evening escape, and the merchants saw only the rising coins in their tills. But Elise, watching her brother grow quieter by the day, felt a thread of fear curl in her chest. She began asking questions in the market, in the alleys, piecing together stories that did not make it to the newspapers. The stranger in the long coat returned many nights. He never sat at the same table, and he never drank more than a single glass. Yet his eyes moved with a quiet intent, as though counting faces, marking conversations. One evening, Henri sketched him from across the room, his pencil moving quick and light, and when he showed it to Luc, the man's sharp eyes and still mouth gave them both pause. "Do you think he's a writer?" Luc asked. Henri only shrugged. Writers, painters, officials. It was hard to tell in a city where everyone wore layers of purpose like heavy coats. As the year turned toward winter's heart, the green fairy of Paris still danced in the cafés, but there was a faint edge in the air, a question that none yet dared to speak fully aloud. What was the cost of this new Parisian charm? And would they see it clearly before it was too late? The nights grew colder as autumn deepened, and the streets of Paris seemed to draw in on themselves, holding their secrets close as the days shortened. Gabriel found himself walking more often along the quiet edges of the Seine, where the water reflected the pale gaslights like trembling stars. He would pause at bridges, staring at the ripples beneath, thinking of the countless people who had stood where he stood, each with their own burdens, their own unanswered questions. The city had a way of swallowing time, of making yesterday feel like an echo. And in those echoes, absinthe seemed to whisper the loudest. It was no longer just a drink. It was becoming a symbol of something larger. Restlessness, hunger for change, or perhaps a kind of collective dream people were chasing without knowing why. Claire, meanwhile, was slipping further into her fascination with a world hidden behind the green curtains of the cafés. She attended gatherings where poets argued over lines of verse, their voices rising as the anise-scented drink loosened their tongues. Painters brought half-finished canvases, their colors bold and chaotic, claiming the green fairy whispered visions to them in the haze of midnight. She sat quietly, sketching faces in her notebook, observing the way the light hit their eyes after the second or third glass. There was always a moment, she noticed, when conversation turned from the lively to the strange, when someone would laugh a little too hard or stare a little too long at the shadows on the wall. It made her uneasy, but it also pulled her deeper, as though the city was teaching her something she didn't yet understand. The press began to stir as winter approached. Newspapers published conflicting reports. One day, praising the cafés as the heart of modern Paris, another warning of a green wave creeping through society. Some stories spoke of ruined men, artists who lost themselves to the drink, or families who sold their heirlooms to feed an unending thirst. Others dismissed these tales as overblown, claiming that the true danger lay not in the glass, but in the choices people made while holding it. Gabriel read every article he could find, underlining names and dates, searching for patterns. He was not alone. Groups began to form. Temperance societies, concerned mothers, even a few doctors, arguing that something needed to change before the green drink became more than just a fashion. Yet, in the quiet hours, he wondered if it was really about the drink at all. Paris was changing. The streets were alive with invention, industry, and art, but beneath it there was also uncertainty. Old traditions clashed with new ideas, and many found themselves caught between them. Absinthe, with its strong aroma and bitter bite, became a kind of mirror for that struggle. Some saw freedom in its glass, others saw ruin. And somewhere between those two visions was the truth, waiting to be uncovered. One fog-laden evening, Gabriel attended a private salon hosted by a minor aristocrat known for collecting both paintings and poets. Claire was there, seated near the window, her sketchbook resting on her lap. The room hummed with quiet tension as guests discussed the drink that had become both a muse and a menace. An older man with silver hair recited lines about a green light leading him through dreams, while a young doctor interrupted to explain the effects of wormwood on the mind, his voice sharp against the velvet walls. The conversation turned, as it often did, toward the question no one seemed able to answer. Was the danger real, or was it a shadow cast by fear? Gabriel asked the doctor quietly, "If it is dangerous, why does it seem to inspire such beauty? Why do so many claim they see clearer with it?" The doctor hesitated, adjusting his spectacles. "Because sometimes what we think is clarity is only the edge of a deeper fog," he said. Claire heard the exchange and wrote the sentence in her notes without saying a word. The streets outside were slick with rain when they left, the lamps casting pale circles on the cobblestones. Gabriel offered to walk Claire home, and for a while they said nothing, listening only to the sound of their boots on wet stone. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "Do you think it's really the drink, Gabriel? Or is it us, wanting to believe something will change our lives if we only sip enough of it?" He looked at her, surprised by the weight in her voice. "Maybe both," he replied, "or maybe neither. But something is moving in this city, Claire. I can feel it." Days stretched into weeks, and winter settled over Paris like a soft shroud. Cafés stayed warm and busy, their windows fogged with the breath of those inside. Outside, the Seine moved slow and dark, carrying secrets past bridges where lovers whispered and strangers exchanged glances. Absinthe's presence did not fade. If anything, it became bolder. Cheaper versions flooded the market, promising the same green glow for half the price, and the cafés grew louder as the nights grew longer. Claire began to notice the toll it took on certain familiar faces. A poet who had once spoken with fire now mumbled to himself in the corner, his hands shaking as he reached for his glass. A painter who once filled canvases with light now left them blank, claiming the visions had turned dark. She sketched them all, each line heavier than the last. Her notebook no longer looked like a collection of Parisian life. It looked like a record of something slowly unraveling. Gabriel, too, felt the shift. Friends he had known for years began to avoid him when they learned of his interest in the drink. Not because he drank it, but because he asked too many questions. He kept a journal, recording every conversation, every strange occurrence tied to the green liquid. Some entries were mundane, prices rising, new cafés opening. Others were strange, reports of sudden fevers, arguments turning to violence, disappearances whispered about but never printed in the papers. One evening, as snow threatened at the edges of the city, Gabriel received an envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single note. If you want to understand the Green Fairy, come to Rue de Martyrs. Midnight. Ask for the back room. There was no signature, no seal, only a faint scent, bitter and sweet, clinging to the paper. He turned it over in his hands for a long while, wondering who had sent it. Claire had not mentioned any such meeting, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. When he arrived at the cafe that night, the front room was as lively as ever, smoke curling in the air, spoons clinking against sugar cubes. He asked for the back room, and the waiter's eyes flickered for a moment before he nodded. The door closed behind him, and the noise of the cafe faded. A small group sat around a table, their faces half hidden by the shadows of a single lamp. They looked up as he entered, their expressions unreadable. Gabriel Fournier, one of them asked, her voice low but steady. He nodded, and they gestured for him to sit. On the table was a bottle, greener than any he had seen before, its label worn with age. No one poured a glass. They simply watched him, waiting. "Why am I here?" he asked. The woman leaned forward. "Because you keep asking questions," she said, "and because soon the city will have to answer them." The door creaked behind him, and he turned, half expecting Claire to walk in. But was only the waiter, setting down another lamp, the light flickering as if uncertain. For a heartbeat, Gabriel thought he saw something in the green glass, something shifting like the reflection of a face that was not his own. As the night deepened, the streets of Montmartre seemed to hum with a strange kind of quiet energy. The lamps flickered, and shadows stretched long against the walls of narrow alleys where life moved both quickly and slowly, depending on who you watched. Emily pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she crossed Rue de Martyrs, her footsteps echoing faintly against the cobblestones. She was not afraid. She had walked this path many times, but tonight there was something about the air that felt different. It wasn't just the cool breeze rolling off the Seine. It was as if the entire city held its breath, waiting for something unseen. The cafe she worked in had become a second home to her, a small but lively place that welcomed artists, poets, laborers, and curious travelers alike. Inside, the green-hued drink flowed freely, each glass carrying whispers of forgotten dreams and bold ambitions. Emily had learned to recognize the way people changed after a few sips, how their faces softened, their words became looser, their laughter rose a little too easily. There was magic in it, or so they said, though she was never sure if it was magic or simply a mirror reflecting what was already hidden inside them. Across the city, in a dimly lit study near the Boulevard Saint-Germain, Dr. Fournier leaned over his desk, his fingers tapping against a pile of letters and clippings. Each one told a story, an artist gone mad, a writer lost in strange visions, a man who claimed to have seen shadows that spoke to him after just one glass too many. Fournier was no fool. He knew the human mind could be fragile, that life in Paris was filled with pressures and passions that could break even the strongest spirits. But there was a pattern here, something that tugged at the edge of explanation. He lit a candle and read through the reports again, the wax dripping slowly like the hours he was losing to this strange investigation. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Latin Quarter, a painter named Julian stared at a blank canvas, his fingers stained with green from the absinthe-soaked brush he had pressed against the edge of his palette. For weeks, he had been unable to paint the way he once did. The colors felt wrong, the shapes blurred, the images in his head shifted before he could capture them. Yet each night, he returned to the same cafe, ordered the same glass, and waited for inspiration to strike. It was as though the drink had taken something from him, but he couldn't stop chasing the peace it promised to give back. In another corner of the city, the café owner Pierre counted his earnings with a careful hand. The Absinthe Craze had brought him customers from all walks of life, and his little establishment was thriving in a way he had never imagined. Yet even as the coins piled higher, a seed of unease grew in him. He had seen too many arguments turn to fights, too many late-night confessions that led to despair come morning. The drink was good for business, yes, but was it good for the soul of Paris? Sometimes, when the candles burned low and the laughter faded, he wondered how much of this was simply fashion, and how much was something darker creeping through the veins of the city. Each of these people, Emily, Dr. Fournier, Julien, Pierre, moved through their nights unaware of the others, yet connected by the same green thread that wove itself through the streets of Paris. The drink had become more than just a pastime. It was a phenomenon, a shadow lingering at the edge of every conversation, every painting, every whispered rumor in the marketplaces and cafés. Newspapers began to print stories. Some were warnings, others were almost celebratory, about the spirit they called La Fée Verte, the Green Fairy. There were stories of lovers who swore their affection deepened over a shared glass, and tales of friends who parted as enemies after one too many. Doctors spoke of its effects in hushed tones, some convinced it was no worse than wine, others certain it held a poison the city had yet to name. Politicians debated quietly, careful not to anger the growing number of producers who made their fortunes from its demand. Paris was alive with questions, but answers were scarce. On one particularly cold evening, Emily noticed a new face in the café. He was tall, his coat frayed at the edges, and his eyes sharp in a way that made her pause. He asked for a glass, then another, but unlike the others, he did not laugh or loosen. He watched, he listened, and when the room grew loud with chatter and song, he slipped a small notebook from his pocket and began to write. She could not help but glance his way from time to time, wondering what words filled those pages. Was he an artist? A critic? Or perhaps someone sent to study the very thing that had begun to define their nights? In the days that followed, the tension in the air seemed to grow. Posters began to appear near the bridges, warning of the dangers of excessive drinking. Yet the café stayed full. The factories that produced the drink ran day and night, their workers tired but proud to be part of something that touched every corner of the city. Children carried bottles to their fathers. Artists painted their visions under its influence, and the Green Fairy, real or imagined, became a silent companion in the dreams of Paris. Still, behind the glow of gaslights and the hum of the streets, there were whispers of things left unsaid, whispers of minds unraveling, of strange sights seen in the haze, of a night where someone vanished and was never quite found again. And as winter pressed in, as the Seine turned dark and slow, and the café stayed warm and loud, those whispers began to feel like something more than just stories. Dr. Fournier wrote one more letter that night, sealing it with a careful hand. It was addressed to a man who knew the factories well, someone who had seen the leaves arrive by the wagon load, crushed and mixed, and poured into bottles that would soon line the shelves of every café in Paris. There was something Fournier wanted to know, something he suspected no one was willing to speak about in the open. But if there was a truth behind the Green Fairy's charm, he was determined to find it, even if it meant unraveling a part of the city everyone had grown to depend on. And as Emily blew out the last candle in the café, locking the door behind her, she could not shake the feeling that the night was heavier than it should have been, that somewhere in the dark, something was shifting, something that would not stay hidden for long. The nights in Paris were growing longer, or so it felt to those caught up in the world of absinthe. Henri walked the same cobblestone path every evening, lantern light stretching his shadow against the damp walls. He was a quiet man, once a clerk in a bookshop, now a restless wanderer pulled by the same green spell that seemed to grip the whole city. Each night, he promised himself it would be the last, and each night he found himself on the same street, heading for the same café where the scent of anise drifted out like a whisper calling his name. People like Henri did not look dangerous or reckless. There were poets, workers, tailors, students, ordinary souls drawn to something that felt like freedom in a glass. Inside the cafe, the room hummed with low voices. The tables were crowded, candles flickering in the draft as servers wove between them with practiced ease. On one side of the room, a painter stared at his sketchbook, his eyes heavy, his fingers stained with green rings from the dripping spoon. On the other, a seamstress laughed too loud. Her cheeks flushed from the drink she swore helped her forget her long hours at the factory. The Green Fairy, as they called it, was no longer just a drink. It was a mood that wrapped around the whole city. People believed it made colors sharper, made music feel closer, made ordinary nights stretch into something almost dreamlike. Henri took his seat and watched the ritual unfold. A glass set down, a sugar cube balanced across a silver spoon, cold water dripping slowly, turning the liquid a pale cloud. It was a slow dance, almost hypnotic, and that was part of the charm. The world outside rushed, but here everything waited for the swirl of green to turn milky and soft. Across the table sat Marianne, a schoolteacher who had once taught his younger sister. Her eyes were clear, but her fingers trembled slightly as she stirred her drink. They had been meeting here by chance for weeks now, both caught in the same unspoken question. Was this drink a doorway to art, to conversation, to something beyond the narrow lines of their days? Or was it a trap waiting to close? Rumors had started to swirl, not just in the papers but in the quiet talk between patrons. A man from Montmartre had vanished after a week of heavy drinking. A young poet claimed the Green Fairy had whispered to him in his sleep and made him burn his manuscripts. A woman said her husband had become a stranger after too many nights in the cafés, staring at walls only he could see. The doctors spoke in cautious tones, the politicians even more so. Yet the streets remained full at night, the tables full of glasses, the spoons clinking against porcelain. Whatever it was, medicine, poison, or Muse, it had its hold. The cafe owner, an older man with thinning hair, polished the counter as he listened to the laughter swell. He had seen this before, in smaller ways, a fashion for strong coffee, a wave of sweet liqueurs. But this was different. Absinthe made people stay longer, talk softer, linger until the lamps burned out. He worried about the tension building outside the doors, police watching the crowds, doctors visiting unannounced, city leaders muttering about bans and taxes. Still, each night he opened, because closing meant ruin, and ruin meant giving up the only thing that had kept his business alive through the cold years. Marianne leaned closer to Henri. "Do you think they're right?" she asked. "About it making people lose themselves?" Her voice was low, but her eyes were searching. Henri didn't answer right away. He looked at the swirl in his glass, the way the pale green curled like smoke, and thought about the stories. He thought about his brother, once a painter full of fire, now pale and distant, living only in the hours between dusk and dawn. "I think," Henri said slowly, "it makes people see what they already want to see, and that can be dangerous." Outside, the rain had started to fall again, slicking the stones and dimming the street lamps. A carriage rattled by, its wheels sending up a spray that caught the ankles of a passing boy. He ran on without a word, his pockets full of newspapers shouting about absinthe fever and new regulations to come. The city was not quieting down, it was building towards something. The drink was not just a drink anymore. It had become a question of freedom, of art, of control. Who decided what was safe? Who decided what was too much? Henri and Marianne watched as a new group entered, artists with their jackets damp from the rain. They carried sketches, half-finished, and spoke in quick bursts about color and form. One of them pulled out a flask of something stronger, but it was the green glasses that lined the table when they finally settled. There was a sense of being part of a moment, as though history was forming itself around their cups and their words. No one wanted to leave too early. No one wanted to be the one to miss the night the great idea would finally appear. As the hours passed, the room grew warm and close. The candles burned lower, and the air turned thick with smoke and whispers. Henri noticed a man at the far end of the room who had been sitting alone for hours, his coat collar pulled high, his hat tipped low. Every so often he would write something in a small book, glance around, and sip his drink without stirring it. There was a tension about him, a stillness that did not belong in the shifting light of the cafe. Marianne noticed too, her hand pausing over her glass as she whispered, "Do you know him?" Henri shook his head, but his eyes stayed fixed on the stranger. The stranger rose just before closing, leaving his glass half full. He left a coin on the table and stepped out into the rain without a word. When the door swung shut behind him, the room felt lighter, as though a draft had finally passed through. But the memory of him lingered. What was he writing, and why had he come night after night to watch and not join? Henri had a feeling they would see him again, and not just in passing. As dawn crept closer, the cafe emptied, one by one. The chairs were turned up, the lamps dimmed, the streets still wet and quiet. Henri stepped out into the chill air, Marianne at his side, both of them silent as they walked back toward their separate streets. The city smelled of damp stone and distant smoke. Somewhere a clock struck 5. The green fairy had gone to rest, but her presence lingered in the corners of their thoughts. Far away, in an office with high ceilings and tall windows, a group of men sat around a table. Papers were spread before them, cups of strong black coffee cooling at their elbows. They spoke of limits, of warnings, of how much was too much for a city already on edge with change. Letters had come from doctors, from wives, from men who swore their fortunes were slipping away because of this drink. Yet letters had also come from cafés, from artists, from those who claimed it was the lifeblood of their work. The debate was no longer private. It was about to become public. And when it did, the quiet nights of absinthe would never be the same. Henri didn't know any of this yet. All he knew was the sound of his boots on wet stone and the strange sense that something was building around him, slow but certain. There would be another night, and another after that, until the city decided what to do. But for now, the lamps went out, the glasses were washed, and the green fairy waited for her hour to come again. The nights in Paris had grown cooler, but the air inside the absinthe bars was thick and warm, as if the very walls were breathing. Henri sat alone at his usual table in the corner, a glass already half empty. The ritual had become second nature to him now. The slow drip of water, the swirl of sugar, the clouding of the emerald liquid until it turned pale and milky. He thought of Elise and the nights they had spent wandering the streets, their laughter echoing under the gas lamps, before this strange obsession had taken hold of her. Now, she spent her evenings chasing whispers of new recipes, secret gatherings, and people who claimed the drink unlocked visions. Henri wanted to believe she was just curious, but deep down, he feared there was something more dangerous waiting behind her new fascination. At the bar, a man with a heavy coat and a sharp jawline leaned in close to the bartender, speaking in hushed tones. Henri noticed the way his eyes swept the room, as though searching for someone. Rumors had been circulating about investigators sent to monitor the absinthe trade. There were whispers that too many people were slipping into sickness, that the green drink was more than just a pleasant escape. Some said rival drink merchants were behind the panic, others that the government wanted a reason to tax the cafés even more. Henri wasn't sure which story to believe, but he felt the unease crawling up the back of his neck all the same. Meanwhile, Elise was nowhere to be seen. She had mentioned earlier that day about meeting someone who had a bottle unlike any other, a distillation said to be closer to the original recipe, the one poets swore by in secret circles. Henri had begged her to stay home, just this once, but she had only smiled and kissed his cheek. "You'll understand when you see," she had whispered before stepping into the cold night. Now, hours later, her absence gnawed at him like a restless ache. He thought of the strange gatherings he had heard about. Rooms filled with artists, doctors, and aristocrats, all passing the glass like it was a shared key to some hidden door. At a table near the window, a painter with streaks of green on his cuffs sketched furiously in the dim light. His subject wasn't the cafe itself, but something that seemed to loom behind it, tall, strange, almost alive. Henri couldn't quite see the shapes, but they reminded him of the strange stories told by those who drank too much, the ones who claimed absinthe made them see what others could not. The painter muttered under his breath as his charcoal moved faster, his fingers smudging the paper until it looked like a shadow with a face. Across town, Elise was standing in a dimly lit room with a group of people she barely knew. The air smelled of licorice and damp stone. Bottles lined the walls, some clear, some cloudy, all labeled in careful handwriting. The man who had invited her there, Monsieur Villette, was speaking about purity, about restoring the drink to its true form. He spoke with the fervor of a preacher, his voice low and heavy with promises. Elise felt her fingers tighten around the glass he handed her, the liquid inside glowing faintly even in the half-light. She thought of Henri and the way he had looked at her before she left, the concern hidden behind his quiet smile. But something in her chest told her this was a moment she couldn't turn away from. Back in the cafe, Henri overheard two men arguing quietly. One was saying that the government would soon put a stop to it, that raids were coming. The other scoffed, saying they would never dare. Too many wealthy names were tied to the trade. Henri felt a chill run through him. If Elise was where he feared she might be, then she was walking straight into a storm that neither side truly understood. It wasn't just a drink anymore. It had become a symbol, a tool, a shadow creeping through the city streets. The waiter passed by with a tray of fresh glasses, the scent of the herbs drifting like a ghost. Henri took a deep breath and stood, leaving his half-finished drink behind. The night outside was thick with fog, the kind that made the lamps look like stars sinking in the mist. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't sit still. Somewhere out there, Elise was following a path that felt more and more like a trap with each passing hour. As the city slept, the factories on the outskirts continued to boil their mixtures. The rivers carried away their waste, and the artists kept painting the same swirling shapes in their corners. There was talk of madness, of inspiration, of poison. Each story twisted into the next until no one could tell where the truth began or ended. And somewhere in that tangle of streets and stories, something waited, something that had been pulling at them all along. Henri turned into a narrow alley, the stones slick with rain. He thought he heard a whisper, maybe just the wind, maybe something more. A faint glow ahead caught his eye, a door slightly ajar, the sound of low voices within. His hand hovered over the wood, uncertain whether to knock or to walk away. Behind that door could be the answer to why Paris had fallen under this green spell, or the start of something far worse. The days began to blur together for those who lived in the glow of Absinthe's green shadow. Etienne found himself wandering more often to the café on Rue des Martyrs, where the chairs were worn smooth by countless restless patrons, and the clock seemed to lose its grip on the passing hours. People came with secrets they wanted to share only with their glass, and somehow those secrets spilled into the air for anyone listening closely enough. The painter spoke in hurried whispers about commissions lost, poets confessed lines that never left their notebooks, and musicians with empty pockets strummed broken melodies for a few coins, their hands trembling from too many sleepless nights. The scent of anise hung so thick in the air that even those who didn't drink could taste its bitterness on their lips. The conflict was no longer just in the cafes, though. It seeped into the streets, into the small apartments where families lived too close together, and into the conversations that began with laughter and ended in quiet unease. There were murmurs in the marketplace of absinthe ruining men faster than debt or winter, and in the dim backrooms of bars, officials spoke of new regulations, their hands tapping nervously against tables sticky with spilled drink. The city had started to notice, and once Paris noticed, it rarely turned away. Lucien, a young painter whose talent had been praised just a year before, had all but vanished from his former circles. His friends remembered how he once painted mornings like they were made of gold, each sunrise captured with gentle strokes that warmed the soul. But now his canvases lay unfinished, gathering dust in a studio that smelled faintly of mold and forgotten promises. He still came to the cafe, always with the same distant stare, always leaving his coins behind for one more glass. Rumors whispered that he was working on a masterpiece, something that would change everything, but no one had seen it. and perhaps no one wanted to. The café's owner, an aging widow named Cecile, watched over them all like a reluctant guardian. She had inherited the place from her late husband, who once dreamed of filling it with music and dancers, not tired souls and empty eyes. She did not drink the green fairy herself, though she poured it with the skill of someone who had learned long ago that in Paris, refusing to serve what the people wanted was the quickest way to close your doors. But she had seen the change in her patrons, the slow unraveling that began with a quiet sip and ended with silence that stretched on far too long. Meanwhile, in the salons of the wealthy, absinthe was discussed with the same fascination one reserved for exotic animals. There were arguments over its supposed virtues, its ability to inspire the mind, to free the hand of the artist and the tongue of the poet. Bottles with ornate labels arrived from Switzerland and were displayed like rare gems, the emerald liquid catching the gaslight in a way that made even the skeptics pause. But beneath the charm of their words, there was a trace of unease. Too many scandals had already touched their social circles. Marriages strained, investments lost, reputations left in the gutter after one too many indulgences. They whispered of a reckoning, though none dared predict when it would come. Etienne, who once thought himself an observer in this strange play, found that he had become a participant without meaning to. His evenings stretched longer, his mornings came later, and his mind wandered even when he was sober. He began to dream of strange lights in the streets, of laughter that turned to echoing cries, of the sound of a spoon stirring endlessly in a glass that was never empty. The more he tried to write about it, the less sense it made, yet the more real it felt. Something about the city was shifting, as though the very stones of Paris were beginning to hum with restless energy. There was also a growing presence of authority in the places where the green fairy thrived. Uniformed men began visiting cafés under the guise of casual patrons, their eyes too sharp and their questions too practiced. They asked how much people drank, how often, and what they felt when they did. Some suspected they were there to build a case for stricter laws, while others believed they were simply curious, unwilling to admit their own fascination with the drink's dark reputation. Either way, their presence made the air heavier, and conversations faltered when they entered. Not everyone believed the tales of absinthe's curse. To some, it was simply a drink, a strong one, yes, but no worse than the wine that had flowed through Paris for centuries. They argued that poverty ruined more lives than any bottle ever could, and that those who stumbled had often been walking on uneven ground long before their first taste. Yet even among the skeptics, there was a strange agreement. Something about this moment in time felt fragile, as if the city was holding its breath and waiting for something to break. One cold evening, the wind rattled the shutters of the café and brought with it a man few recognized. He was not young, but his posture carried a certain defiance, the kind born from years of watching trends rise and fall. He ordered absinthe without hesitation and drank it slowly, his eyes scanning the room as if he were measuring its very walls. When he finally spoke, it was not to anyone in particular, but the words carried in the stillness. You are all waiting for Paris to choose, but Paris does not choose. It consumes. No one knew what he meant, and before they could ask, he was gone. As the nights wore on, the stories became stranger. There were tales of visions, of people seeing colors that didn't exist, hearing music that no instrument could play. Some claimed the green fairy whispered promises of greatness, if only they would drink a little more, stay a little longer. Others swore they felt her eyes on them in the dark, cold and curious. The line between inspiration and obsession blurred, and the city, already prone to excess, began to dance on its edge. In Montmartre, a small group of reformers met in secret. They spoke of saving Paris from itself, of putting an end to the spreading craze before it hollowed out a generation. Their leader, a sharp-tongued woman named Marguerite, had once been a singer in the same cafés she now despised. She gathered names, wrote letters, and planned speeches that might one day stir the crowds as her songs once did. But even she knew that to challenge absinthe openly was to invite resistance, not just from those who profited from it, but from those who clung to it like a lifeline in a city that often forgot their names. The conflict grew quieter and louder at once. It was in the cough of a child whose father had sold his winter coat for another bottle. It was in the nervous glance of a poet handing over his last coin. It was in the laughter that rose from the streets and turned sharp as the night deepened. And always, it was in the glow of the glass, where a simple swirl of liquid seemed to promise more than any man could deliver. Etienne watched it all unfold, his pen still moving, but his words heavy now. He no longer wrote about the color of the drink or the shape of the spoons. He wrote about the hollow in the eyes of those who came and never truly left. He wondered what the city would look like when the green faded, if it ever did. And somewhere in that wondering, a question began to form. What if the drink was not the cause, but the symptom? What if Paris itself had always been thirsty, and absinthe was merely the latest flavor it chose to sip? The streets grew colder as winter deepened, but the nights stayed warm with talk, music, and the ever-present swirl of green. No one yet knew what would tip the balance, or when. They only knew that the city was restless, and that something, somewhere, was waiting to happen. The nights grew heavier as summer leaned into autumn, and with it, the atmosphere in Paris became dense with something unspoken. The cafés still bustled, the music halls still sang, but beneath it all was an edge that no one quite named. The green drink had become more than a pastime. It was a symbol of release, of escape, and for some, of rebellion. Henri found himself sketching late into the night, the lamplight flickering against his pale skin as shadows stretched long across his studio. Empty glasses lined his table like a silent chorus, witnesses to hours he could no longer recall clearly. Somewhere between the strokes of his pencil and the hum of the city below, a question gnawed at him. Was the world around him truly shifting, or was it just his mind slipping through cracks too fine to see? Elise, meanwhile, had begun to notice the same shadows creeping into her own life. At first, it was in the faces of the regulars. Men who once came to her bar for a simple glass now sat for hours, staring through the smoke as if waiting for something to appear. The laughter that used to echo from the back tables had dulled into murmurs, and the music seemed slower, heavier, as if dragging its feet through the night. She still served them, still polished the counters, still smiled when they asked for another pour, but her eyes often drifted to the door, half hoping someone would walk in with answers she couldn't find herself. It wasn't just the drink, it was something about the way the city seemed to lean on it, like a crutch made of mist. Artists whispered of visions that came in the glass, bright colors, strange shapes, fleeting flashes of genius that never quite stayed in the morning. Writers swore they had seen ideas bloom like flowers before their eyes, only for the petals to fall by dawn. And then there were the others, the ones who spoke of absinthe not as a muse, but as a trickster, a green fox slipping between their thoughts and leaving footprints they could not erase. The newspapers printed little warnings, scattered among advertisements for opera tickets and new hats. Talk of rising hospital visits, of men found wandering the streets, unable to recall their own names. But the warnings were always small, tucked between the lines, easy to ignore if one preferred to. Henri found himself at the center of an uneasy circle. Patrons asked for his sketches now. Collectors whispered of a new edge in his work. They said it was daring, fevered, alive. But Henri felt none of that life when he put down the pencil. He felt hollow, as though something was pulling his thoughts like strings and leaving the rest of him behind. Elise noticed it too. She brought him food he forgot to eat, closed the shutters when he forgot the hour. "You need a break," she told him once, setting down a plate of bread and cheese. "Step away for a few nights. See the world without a glass in your hand." But he only smiled in that tired way of his and said the world was easier to face when it was slightly blurred. As the season turned, a chill came to Paris, and with it, a new round of debates began. The salons filled with talk of banning the drink entirely. Doctors argued in newspapers, poets defended their freedom, and cafe owners worried quietly about their trade. Yet, the bars stayed full, and the green kept flowing a quiet rebellion in every pore. Elise felt caught between two worlds, one where the drink was just another choice on a crowded menu, and another where it was a slow tide rising against the city's better sense. Henri, meanwhile, felt as though every sketch he made was an attempt to catch something slipping past his vision, a glimpse of meaning, a warning, or perhaps only the shadow of his own unrest. One night, the air hung thick with fog that rolled off the river and made the gas lamps glow like stars caught in milk. Henri had been gone longer than usual, wandering the streets with a group of painters who spoke of capturing the truth behind the veil, whatever that meant. Elise waited for him, the bar nearly empty save for a man in a dark coat who sat near the door, stirring his drink slowly. He asked few questions, only watched, as though he, too, was waiting for something or someone. When Henri finally returned, his hands were stained with charcoal, his eyes sharp and restless. He whispered to Elise that he had seen something in the fog, something he couldn't quite explain, a flicker at the edge of the lamplight that made his heart pound. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm that felt both familiar and strange. Henri's sketches became darker, more angular, and patrons whispered of a brilliance born from madness. Elise began keeping a journal behind the bar, noting the names of regulars who no longer appeared, the strange conversations that flickered between tables, the way some laughed too loudly at nothing at all. She wondered if it was only her imagination or if the whole of Montmartre was slipping into a kind of waking dream. And then came the letter. No return address, no sender's name, just a folded sheet left under the door of the bar one cold morning. Inside was a single sentence, scrawled in hurried ink. Meet me by the river before the fog lifts. He's not alone anymore. Elise read it twice, the chill from the stone floor creeping into her shoes. She didn't know if it was meant for her or for someone else entirely, but when Henri came in hours later, pale and distracted, she saw the same unease in his eyes. He didn't ask about the letter, but she suspected he had received one too. The city seemed to hold its breath. The nights grew longer, the fog thicker, the debates louder. Was the green drink to blame for the unrest that simmered beneath the cobblestones? Or was it simply a mirror, reflecting something already broken? Elise found herself glancing at every stranger who passed through the bar, wondering who among them carried answers, and who carried only more questions. Henri, for his part, had started speaking less, as if saving his words for something yet to come. Sometimes she caught him staring at the glass before him, not drinking, not moving, just staring, as if waiting for it to speak. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the streets were still and the city's heartbeat slowed, both of them felt it, that there was something building, something pressing at the edges of the night. Not just a story of drink or art or rebellion, but something that wound through all of them like a green ribbon pulled too tight. They didn't know yet what it was or when it would show its face, but they knew they were already too close to turn away. The tension in Paris reached a new peak as summer wore on. Nights grew hotter, and with them, tempers and fears flared. The cafés of Montmartre seemed alive with whispers, their tables crowded with the usual mix of artists, poets, and dreamers. But their laughter was thinner now, and their eyes darted more often toward the green glass bottles gleaming under the gas lamps. Absinthe had become more than a drink. It was now a symbol, a spark in a city dry with unrest. Each glass poured seemed to carry with it both promise and threat, and the air was thick with the question of how long the city could hold itself together before something snapped. Lucien found himself walking more often at night, his mind restless, unable to quiet the thoughts stirred by the chaos unfolding around him. On the boulevard, posters warned of rising absinthe consumption, their bold black letters declaring it the green curse. Yet in the very same streets, kiosks sold illustrated papers showing glamorous scenes of the drink. Beautiful women lifting glasses, artists leaning over their sketches, laughter spilling like wine onto the cobblestones. The city was at war with itself, torn between its need for escape and its fear of collapse. Lucien wondered where he belonged in it all, and if he too was becoming another thread in this fraying tapestry. Madeleine's cafe had changed as well. The crowds had grown, but so had the tension among them. Patrons whispered about raids rumored to come, about politicians calling for absinthe to be banned, about strange happenings on the outskirts of the city, workers collapsing at the end of long shifts, artists waking in the streets with no memory of their nights. Some said it was the drink, others said it was the times themselves, uncertain, unsteady, pushing people to the edge. Madeline kept her voice calm, her hands steady as she poured. But Lucien saw the worry in her eyes when she counted the coins at the end of the night, or when she locked the door and lingered too long staring at the street outside. One evening, a man arrived who drew every eye in the room. He was well-dressed, his hat set low, his coat tailored in a way that spoke of money not recently earned but long held. He took a table near the corner and ordered a glass of absinthe, then another, and another still. He said little, but Lucien, seated nearby, caught fragments of his conversation when a friend joined him. They spoke of laws to come, of a push in Parliament to not only restrict the sale of absinthe, but to make an example of those who served it. They want a face for the papers, the man said, his voice low and sharp. Someone to carry the blame, someone they can hold up as the one who poisoned Paris. Lucien felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach as he watched Madeline glide past with a tray, unaware of how close her little café might be to the fire. Outside, the city was alive with protests. Workers filled the streets, their chants rising with the summer heat, their demands simple and fierce. Fair wages, decent hours, an end to the hunger that gnawed at their families. Among their banners, a few bore the green stains of absinthe, blaming the drink for their poverty, their pain. Others defended it, saying it was the only thing that kept them from despair. The boulevard became a stage where every voice shouted at once, and in the confusion, the drink grew not weaker, but stronger, flowing from hand to hand like a secret pact. Lucien began to sketch again, though his lines were darker now, his portrait sharper. He drew the drinkers hunched over their glasses, the politicians with their polished shoes, the workers with their calloused hands. He drew Madeline, too, standing in the doorway with a look that was part defiance, part fear. He didn't show these sketches to her. Not yet. Some nights he wondered if he should leave Paris entirely, return to the countryside and its quieter rhythms. But each time he stayed, drawn by the strange pull of the city at this fevered moment. One night, as the bells of Saint-Germain struck midnight, he found himself in the square near the river, where rumors said the first bans would be enforced. There were uniformed men gathered there, their breath visible in the cool night air, their eyes scanning the crowd for signs of trouble. A cart rattled past, its driver huddled against the wind, a faint glow from the crates within revealing green glass bottles. Lucien wondered how long such things could continue unnoticed, and how many hands were already paid to look away. At the same time, whispers reached the cafés of something darker. Batches of absinthe that made drinkers ill, seizures that struck without warning. A painter who collapsed mid-stroke, his brush falling from his fingers as his eyes stared blankly at the canvas. Some said it was poison, others said it was madness, but no one could say where it began. The more the authorities talked of bans, the more the underground trade thrived, and with it, the risk of something truly dangerous finding its way into the glasses of the unsuspecting. Madeline, too, heard these whispers. One evening, she asked Lucien to stay after closing. The café was silent, the lamps dimmed to shadows. She poured them each a small drink, her hands trembling slightly as she did. "I think they're going to make an example of someone," she said, her voice soft but steady. "And I think they're going to look here." She didn't say more, but the weight of her words hung between them like smoke. Lucien didn't know what to answer. He had no power in this city, only his sketches, his steps, and the strange sense that they were all moving towards something none of them could yet see. The weeks that followed were marked by raids in other parts of Paris. Bottles smashed in the gutters, doors sealed, names printed in the morning papers alongside words like corruption and vice. Each story only deepened the divide. Some cheered the crackdown, others cursed it, and through it all, the cafés of Montmartre clung to their fragile freedom, their doors still open, their patrons still whispering over their green drinks. By early autumn, The tension was so thick it felt as if the city itself held its breath. There were nights when the streets were empty, the lamplight stretching long and thin across the stones, and other nights when the boulevards roared with voices, drums, and the sharp crack of boots. Lucien walked among them, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, feeling the edge of something near, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then came the night when a fire broke out in a cellar near the river, a place known for storing barrels and bottles meant for cafés across the city. Flames licked at the sky, turning it orange and black, the smoke curling into the narrow streets. People gathered, shouting, some swearing it was an accident, others claiming it was a message. Among the crowd, Lucien thought he saw a familiar face, a man from Madeleine's cafe, slipping away into the shadows before anyone could stop him. The next day, the papers were full of it. Theories, accusations, warnings. The word ban was printed in bold on every headline. Yet the city kept drinking, if only to calm its frayed nerves. And somewhere in that tension, Lucien felt something shift. It was no longer a question of if the crackdown would come, but when, and who would be standing in its path when it did. The night air had grown heavy over Montmartre, and a mist rolled along the narrow lanes, wrapping the city in a strange silence. The gas lamps flickered as though uncertain whether to burn or surrender to the darkness. In the cabaret, whispers had grown louder. Every table seemed to have its own theory about what was really happening behind the green drink. Some swore it was all in their heads, a fevered fancy born of too many sleepless nights and too much cheap food. Others claimed they had seen things, shadows moving when no one passed, glimmers of green light at the edges of their vision long after the glasses were emptied. The word madness was starting to creep into conversations, though few dared to speak it above a hush. It felt dangerous, as though the word itself might summon something. Etienne had not been seen for 2 days, and those who remembered him from the cabaret began to wonder whether the stories he had been chasing were too much for one man to hold. Marcel found himself pacing more often now, torn between keeping his head down or following the same trail his friend had taken. The air in the cafe where he once served laughter and drink now carried an edge of unease. The regulars noticed. They asked fewer questions, paid their coins with less talk, and left more quickly than before. The green liquid that once inspired conversation now made the silence louder. Down by the Seine, bargemen spoke of crates arriving at odd hours. Some said they came from across the border. Others whispered they were local, born in hidden cellars far from the watchful eyes of officials. The government had begun to mutter about regulations, about taxes, about the safety of the public, but their words were thin and easily lost in the smoke-filled air of the absinthe houses. And still the drink flowed. It was too cheap, too available, too easy to pour into a waiting glass. The city was hooked not only on its taste, but on the escape it offered, brief as it was. Marguerite began to keep a journal. Her hands trembled sometimes when she wrote, as though her own thoughts betrayed her. She recorded what she saw, the way certain patrons stared too long into their drinks, the way some left with wild eyes, the way the cobblestones seemed to hum under her feet as she walked home at dawn. She wrote about Marcel, too, his restlessness, his sudden silences. He was changing, she thought. Paris was changing. The Absinthe Craze was no longer just a fashion. It was a fever, and the city was sweating through it. One rainy evening, Marcel followed a trail of rumors to the edge of the Marais district. There, a narrow courtyard hid a shop with no sign, only a green bottle painted on its door. Inside, a man with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers sold bottles to a crowd that did not speak. No one met anyone's gaze. Coins clinked, corks popped, and the green liquid glimmered under the weak lantern light. Marcel bought nothing. He only watched. But when he turned to leave, the man behind the counter caught his sleeve and whispered a name he did not expect, Etienne. The name lingered in his mind as he walked back through the rain. It meant his friend had been there, maybe recently. It also meant he was being watched, and that knowledge sat uneasily in his chest. Who was watching? Who was pulling the strings that let this drink flood the veins of the city while whispers of danger coiled around it? On the boulevards, the posters for Absinthe grew bolder. They promised joy, warmth, inspiration. Some even dared to promise health. Doctors argued in papers and parlors, their words twisting like smoke around the truth that no one seemed able to grasp fully. The drink was cheap and easy. It made the poor forget their hunger and the artists believe in their own genius. But at what cost? Fights broke out in alleys. Lovers quarreled over nothing. A poet threw his manuscript into the fire, convinced it was cursed by what he drank. The city's rhythm had quickened, but the beat was unsteady. Marguerite read her own poems aloud, less often now. Her words sounded hollow in her mouth, as though the city had drained the color from them. But she still walked the streets at night, still listened for what the city might whisper in return. Sometimes she felt it breathe, an old, tired breath of cobblestones and river mist and too many nights spent awake. Paris was restless, and so was she. Then came the letter. It arrived with no sender's name, only a smudge of green wax on its fold. Inside, a few hurried lines. If you want the truth, follow the bottles. But come alone. Midnight, near the old foundry. There was no signature, but the handwriting was Etienne's. Marcel read the letter twice, then folded it so tightly the paper nearly tore. Midnight was only a few hours away. He told no one, not even Marguerite. But she knew something was different when he came by that evening. His coat damp from a mist, and his eyes too sharp for a man who had spent the day behind a counter. He stayed only long enough to drink a cup of coffee, not the green drink. Then he left without another word. The streets were nearly empty when the clock struck midnight. The foundry loomed like a skeleton of iron and shadow, its gates rusted, its windows broken. Marcel stepped inside, boots crunching on old soot. The air smelled of damp and metal, and somewhere in the dark, something moved. A bottle rolled across the floor, its green glow faint but steady. He picked it up and turned it in his hands. It was cold, colder than the night around him. A whisper came from the shadows. His name. He turned, heart pounding, but saw only the shape of a figure slipping between pillars. He followed, the bottle still in his grip, until the sound of footsteps stopped. There, on the floor, lay another letter, this one torn, the words smeared by rain but still legible enough to send a shiver down his spine. It spoke of shipments hidden in plain sight, of names in government offices, of something far older than the craze now sweeping the streets. And at the bottom, a final line, written more recently and in a hand less steady. They know who asks questions. He folded the paper and stepped back, the weight of the city pressing in on him. Paris was wide awake now, and somewhere in its restless veins, something was stirring that would not sleep again so easily. The night air grew heavier as the sound of distant traffic faded into an uneasy silence. Each shadow seemed longer, each echo sharper, as though the city itself held its breath. Rebecca sat quietly in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the dimly lit street ahead. Navarro drove without saying much, his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind was clearly racing. The files they had uncovered earlier were spread across the dashboard, illuminated by the occasional flicker of passing streetlights. Nothing about them made sense anymore. Every piece of evidence seemed to connect, yet the pattern it formed was still elusive, like a puzzle with a missing center. As they neared the old warehouse district, a call came through on Navarro's phone. It was a voice they didn't expect to hear, one of their former informants who had vanished months ago after claiming to know too much. His tone was tense, hurried, as though he was speaking from a place where even walls had ears. "You're looking in the wrong direction," he said before abruptly hanging up. The call lasted less than 10 seconds, but it shifted everything. Rebecca turned to Navarro, her expression unreadable. "That wasn't a warning," she said softly. "That was an invitation." Inside the warehouse, the air smelled of rust and damp concrete. The space was empty at first glance, but something about it felt staged. Footprints led in circles on the dusty floor, as if someone had been pacing there for hours. Navarro crouched down, examining the marks, while Rebecca scanned the corners for hidden cameras. A faint hum from above caught her attention. A small device no larger than a coin was wedged between two beams. It wasn't just a recorder. It was transmitting. Someone was watching them, or worse, listening in real time. Before they could remove it, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the hall. A figure emerged, dressed in plain clothes, but carrying the kind of authority that made both agents tense. He didn't introduce himself, only held up a badge that looked authentic at first glance, but lacked the finer details of an official one. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice calm but cold. "This isn't your case anymore." Rebecca exchanged a quick glance with Navarro. Neither of them moved. "Who says it's not?" Navarro asked. The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he stepped closer and handed them a single envelope before leaving as quietly as he arrived. Inside the envelope was a photograph, grainy, black and white, taken from a distance. It showed the same boy they had been tracking, Subject 12, standing next to a car that had disappeared decades ago. The timestamp on the photo was from the previous week. Rebecca's grip tightened. "That's impossible," she whispered. The boy hadn't aged a day since the first time he appeared in the old files. Navarro looked around the empty warehouse, the sense of being followed growing stronger. "We're not chasing him anymore," he said slowly. "He's leading us." Back at the field office, they spread out everything they had: maps, old reports, witness statements that never made it to trial, and now the photograph. Patterns began to emerge, faint lines connecting people who should never have crossed paths, places that were never on record, and events that official reports claimed never happened. Each connection pointed to the same hidden network, one that operated between government sites, abandoned research facilities, and names erased from public memory. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Files disappeared overnight. Digital backups were corrupted without warning. People who once offered information now refused to speak, their fear too heavy to disguise. The second twist came not from the boy, nor the mysterious figure, but from within their own ranks. An internal message flagged their investigation as unsanctioned. Access codes were revoked, their requests for backup ignored. Rebecca's credentials were temporarily suspended without explanation, leaving her with no official power to act. Navarro received a warning call from a superior who claimed this case was beyond his clearance. Yet neither of them had gone rogue. They were simply following the trail as they were trained to do. Someone higher up wanted it buried. As the walls closed in, subplots began to intertwine. One involved a retired agent who had once led an investigation strikingly similar to theirs, only to vanish before filing his final report. Another involved a series of classified shipments sent to a decommissioned facility on the outskirts of town. Each shipment listed medical equipment, but the manifests were inconsistent. Rebecca followed that lead quietly, meeting an old contact in a late-night diner. He slid a faded document across the table, his eyes darting nervously to the door. "This isn't about the boy," he murmured. "He's just a door. What's behind it? That's what they're afraid of." Back at their safe house, Navarro set up surveillance around the perimeter. The city lights flickered in the distance, but the streets around them remained unusually quiet. "We're running out of time," he said, watching the feed from a small monitor. Rebecca sat at the table, the photograph of the boy still in her hand. "Or maybe," she replied. "Time's the only thing that hasn't changed." The stakes were no longer about solving a case. It was about survival, of their careers, their credibility, and possibly their lives. With every step forward, they felt the ground beneath them shifting, like a trap slowly tightening its grip. The second twist had exposed something much deeper than they anticipated, but it also brought them closer to the truth. Each clue they found led to another unanswered question. Each door they opened revealed another lock behind it. And somewhere in the dark, the boy was watching. Not running, not hiding, waiting. The night was heavier than the one before, and the rain had returned, slicking the roads and turning the city's lights into long, trembling streaks on the pavement. Inside the investigation unit, the tension had become almost unbearable. Files lay open across the table, with names, dates, and locations overlapping in a chaotic web of half-answers. What had started as a disturbing series of disappearances had now grown into something more, a pattern that wasn't just repeating itself, but expanding. Each thread they pulled only revealed more questions, and for the team working tirelessly to uncover the truth, the weight of what was still hidden pressed down like a shadow that wouldn't lift. Rebecca sat with her fingers tracing the edges of an old, weathered photograph found tucked inside one of the sealed boxes. It wasn't listed in the evidence catalog, and that in itself was troubling. The picture showed a man standing by a cabin, his posture stiff, his eyes hollow, as if staring at something just outside the frame. She didn't recognize him, but something about his stance felt unsettlingly familiar. Across the table, Navarro was reviewing the last set of interviews, each one adding a new angle, but no clear direction. Witnesses remembered fragments: a car parked where it shouldn't have been, a voice calling out late at night, a figure standing too still in the distance. Yet none of it fit neatly into the timeline they had built. The breakthrough they had been waiting for didn't come with a dramatic announcement. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A lab technician handed Rebecca a sealed envelope, the results of a re-examined trace from one of the earliest scenes. It wasn't much, a partial fingerprint smudged against a rusted doorframe, but it matched a record that had been classified for decades. The name attached to it sent a ripple through the room. It was someone who had vanished years ago, long declared dead after a disastrous operation that was supposed to have erased all traces of him. If that record was right, then someone they believed gone had not only survived, but returned, and he was now moving behind the curtain of their investigation. Navarro leaned in, his voice low, as though the walls themselves might be listening. If he's involved, this isn't about isolated incidents anymore. This is a pattern built to stay hidden. And if he's resurfacing now, he wants to be found, but only on his terms. It was a chilling thought. The idea that their pursuit might not be the result of their skill, but rather part of someone else's plan, turned the entire operation on its head. Meanwhile, out in the quieter edges of the city, a different thread was unraveling. A local reporter, unaware of how deep the case truly ran, had started asking the wrong questions in the right places. Her curiosity led her to people who had been silent for years, people who still carried fear in their voices when certain names were mentioned. Her notes hinted at a past connection between the missing people and a defunct research project that had been shut down abruptly. No one could tell her why it had ended, only that it had left scars, both on the land and on those who once worked there. Unbeknownst to her, her questions had drawn attention, and someone had started following her too. As these threads began to tangle, a new event threw the team off balance. A package arrived at the precinct, unmarked and with no sender. Inside was a single item, a key card with a date etched into its plastic, and a message scrawled on the back in faint, uneven handwriting. "You're looking in the wrong place." The handwriting was rushed, almost shaky, but there was something deliberate about the way it was delivered. No fingerprints, no traceable route, and no surveillance footage of who left it. Just a message that made the line between hunter and hunted blur even more. The second twist came not from what they found, but from what they failed to find. The person they thought they were closing in on, someone whose movements they had mapped carefully over weeks, suddenly disappeared from every known location. His safe houses were abandoned, his financial traces erased, and every lead they had been following turned into a dead end overnight. It was as if he had been one step ahead the entire time, leading them towards something else entirely. The realization that they might have been steered into this path, rather than uncovering it themselves, shifted the mood in the room. Questions about betrayal and manipulation started to creep in, quietly but persistently. Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that there was a second layer to this case, a mirror running alongside theirs, reflecting their every move. The calls they received, the documents that appeared when they needed them, even the small victories felt orchestrated in hindsight. Someone wanted them to see parts of the truth, while keeping the heart of it locked away. The missing piece wasn't just a name or a motive, it was the very structure of the story they thought they were telling. Navarro decided to widen the net, bringing in old contacts who once worked in the shadowy corners of law enforcement, where paper trails rarely existed. What he learned unsettled him further. There were mentions of a network that operated outside official boundaries, a group that handled situations too delicate or too damaging to ever appear in records. Their methods were unorthodox, their allegiance unclear, but they were known for leaving traces behind, subtle ones, meant only for those who understood their language. And some of the markings they had found near the recent crime scenes matched that pattern. The case had now reached a dangerous tipping point. They weren't just chasing a suspect anymore. They were navigating a maze designed by someone who had been here before them, someone who knew how they worked and what they feared. The package, the photograph, the missing man from decades ago, it was all converging towards something that had not yet shown its full face. And in that convergence lay the second twist. This wasn't just a resurgence of old crimes. It was a continuation of something that had never truly stopped. As the team prepared to follow the newest lead, a location tied to the keycard, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the middle of a story already in motion. The night outside grew darker, the streets quieter, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Somewhere out there, someone was watching them, waiting for the moment when the next piece of the puzzle would fall into place. The stakes had risen, the game had changed, and the shadow they were chasing no longer felt like just one person. It felt like a network, a ghostly thread connecting past and present in ways none of them fully understood yet. The final hours of the investigation brought everything to a boiling point. The city felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the breaking wave of truth that had been building for so long. Rebecca sat in the dimly lit operations room, the hum of monitors and the quiet murmur of agents moving in and out adding to the thick air of tension. Navarro entered with a file, his face pale but determined. He had found the missing piece, the one link that tied all the scattered fragments together. It wasn't just about one crime or one moment of betrayal. It was an entire chain of deliberate choices hidden behind a mask of order. Outside, the rain had turned into a downpour, rattling against the windows as if nature itself was echoing the storm brewing inside. Rebecca opened the file and read in silence, her hands trembling slightly. The name on the page wasn't the one they had expected. It wasn't the usual suspect or the figure they had chased for weeks. It was someone inside their own circle, someone who had walked with them through the dark corridors of doubt, someone they had trusted. The revelation hit like a sudden blow, cutting through the noise of half-truths and suspicions. Navarro spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant confirmation. "We've been looking in the wrong direction the whole time. The signs were there, but we didn't want to see them. They were feeding both sides, keeping the conflict alive, not to stop it, but to control it." Rebecca's mind raced, piecing together every interaction, every warning that seemed too convenient, every delay that cost them precious time. The lines between ally and adversary blurred until they were almost indistinguishable. They didn't have the luxury of hesitation anymore. The clock was ticking, and the final move was already in motion. Somewhere across the city, a meeting was being set up, one that would decide whether the truth would surface or be buried for good. The team moved quickly, splitting into smaller units, each step measured yet filled with urgency. Rebecca and Navarro took the lead, their cars slicing through the wet streets as the city lights smeared against the rain-slicked windows. When they arrived, the building looked ordinary, a quiet structure with no sign of the storm brewing inside. But the moment they stepped through the door, the tension was palpable. Shadows moved in the hallway, whispers echoed behind closed rooms, and every corner seemed to hold a secret waiting to be uncovered. They pressed forward, their footsteps soft, but their presence undeniable. In the heart of that building, the truth finally revealed itself in full. The orchestrator stood there, calm as if the chaos outside was nothing more than a calculated ripple. The files laid on the table, maps pinned to the walls, and coded messages scattered across the desk told a story more intricate than they had ever imagined. It wasn't just corruption. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a network of influence, a machine designed to twist events for gain while letting everyone else believe they were in control. Rebecca stepped closer, her voice low but steady. "All this time, You're the one turning the wheel." The orchestrators smiled faintly, a glint of defiance in their eyes. Control isn't taken. It's given by people who don't want to look too closely. For a moment, the room was frozen, heavy with the weight of choices made and the cost they had carried. The operation unfolded quickly after that. Files were secured, communications were traced, and agents flooded the corridors to dismantle the network piece by piece. Yet even as they closed in, the orchestrator didn't resist. They watched with an expression that was almost serene, as if this moment too had been part of the plan. And then it happened, the final twist none of them had seen coming. Just as they were about to escort the orchestrator out, a coded signal was triggered somewhere deep in the system. Lights flickered, the air filled with a faint hum, and several hard drives began erasing themselves in real time. The evidence they had fought so hard to gather was slipping away like water through their fingers. Navarro rushed to shut it down, shouting instructions, while Rebecca stared at the orchestrator, who offered only a quiet, almost taunting glance. "Truth is only powerful if you can hold on to it," they whispered. The agents worked frantically, salvaging what they could. Some files were saved, some leads preserved, but much of the deeper chain, the one that could expose the full scope, was gone before their eyes. The orchestrator had planned for this, leaving them with just enough to act, but never the full picture. As dawn broke outside, the storm began to ease. Rebecca and Navarro stood in the doorway, the weight of the night still heavy on their shoulders. They had won, in a way. The immediate threat was neutralized, the key players taken into custody, and the city was safe for now. But the real depth of the network remained out there, hidden in shadows that no longer looked so far away. Rebecca glanced at Navarro, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't over, is it?" He shook his head slowly, the city skyline reflected in his tired eyes. "No, it's only just started." The operation had reached its climax, but the ripples it left behind were far from settled. There were still unanswered questions, still names that hadn't been spoken, and still truths waiting to break through the surface. And somewhere, beyond their reach, a quiet observer was already watching, waiting for the next move. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of papers, shuffling, and faint whispers that carried a mix of tension and curiosity. Everyone was waiting for the final words that could turn the entire case on its head. James stood near the witness stand, his eyes moving from one face to another, searching for a sign of truth, or perhaps for the person who still held a piece of the puzzle hidden from sight. Rebecca, sitting only a few steps away, could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips. She had spent months piecing together the fragments of this story, but even she sensed there was something no one had dared to say yet. As the judge prepared to deliver the final decision, a sudden interruption broke the rhythm of the room. The doors at the far end swung open, and a man in a dark coat stepped in, carrying a folder no one had seen before. His arrival drew every eye, his name whispered in low tones. He was an investigator from a completely different jurisdiction, someone who had been working quietly in the shadows all along. He handed the folder to the prosecutor without a word, and the weight of the room shifted. It was as if the air had thickened, every person leaning forward just slightly, waiting to see what secret this last-minute evidence carried. The prosecutor opened it, his expression changing from confusion to something sharper, something colder. Slowly, he turned to face the jury and then the judge, requesting permission to submit what he had just received. Inside were photographs, old reports, and a signed letter that none of them expected, evidence that pointed to a figure everyone had overlooked because they seemed too distant, too removed from the events to be involved. It wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about orchestration, about pulling strings so quietly that no one heard the tune until it was almost too late. Rebecca glanced at James. Her breath caught somewhere between relief and dread. This could change everything they thought they knew. It revealed that while one officer had been at the center of the storm, another figure far above had been moving pieces like a chess master, letting chaos unfold while remaining untouched. It explained why certain files were delayed, why key witnesses vanished from the picture, why evidence sometimes appeared incomplete or tampered with. The name on that letter made several heads turn, because it wasn't a stranger. It was someone whose influence reached into both law enforcement and the courts. The judge called for a short recess to verify the authenticity of the new evidence. And in that break, conversations buzzed like an angry swarm of bees. Some doubted its timing. Others felt it confirmed their suspicions all along. Outside the courtroom, reporters scrambled to make sense of the sudden twist, their cameras following every lawyer and officer as they stepped into the hallways. Rebecca stayed seated, her mind racing, her fingers tapping against her knee. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was becoming a revelation that would ripple far beyond this one trial. James finally sat beside her, lowering his voice. "Do you think this was planned?" he asked. "Or is this just them trying to clean up their mess before it spreads?" She looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Maybe both. But someone didn't want the truth to stay buried forever. They waited for the moment when everyone thought the ending was decided. When the session resumed, the judge allowed the evidence to be presented. The new details unraveled like a rope being cut loose from a hidden knot, and each piece connected to moments the jury had heard before. Only now, they made more sense, darker sense. The supposed hero who had testified early on, the one who claimed to expose the wrongdoing, had actually been shielding the true architect, using the chaos to divert attention and protect a chain of command that benefited from every misstep below. Gasps filled the room as more names emerged, and what had seemed like a single thread of corruption turned into a web. James clenched his jaw. The climax was not just about catching one person. It was about exposing the entire structure that allowed this to happen. And with that exposure came risk, because everyone knew that pulling at such a web meant someone might still try to cut the line, even now. As the final testimonies were heard and the last evidence displayed, the courtroom felt less like a place of judgment and more like a stage where truths long hidden were finally stepping into the light. The defendant, who had once seemed either guilty or victim depending on the day, now looked more like a pawn caught in the middle of a game that had too many players. The real battle wasn't just about law. It was about control, reputation, and how far powerful people would go to keep their shadows intact. Then, just as the closing arguments were about to begin, a startling moment froze everyone in their place. One of the jurors, a woman who had remained silent throughout, suddenly stood up, her hand trembling as she pointed to the man who had brought in the folder. "I know you," she whispered. "You were there that night." The room erupted again, the judge slamming his gavel to restore order. Cameras turned, lawyers protested, and the man's face stayed unreadable, his silence more telling than any denial could be. That one sentence added another layer to an already tangled climax. It suggested that even the savior figure who brought the truth might not be entirely free of the same night's shadows. Rebecca's stomach turned. How much of this was truth, and how much was still theater? Were they finally uncovering the real story? Or had someone decided that sacrificing a few visible players would satisfy the public, while the deeper rot remained hidden? The judge called for order, his voice cutting through the murmurs, and announced that everything had to be addressed before the verdict could proceed. The trial was no longer about a single action. It had become a mirror reflecting the flaws of an entire system. Outside, rain began to fall, streaking the windows and muting the flashes of the cameras waiting to catch the faces of those walking out later that night. Rebecca looked at James one more time. "Whatever happens after this," she said quietly, "the story isn't over when they give that verdict. It's only going to start spreading from here." As the town slowly returned to a steady rhythm, the memory of what had unfolded lingered in every conversation, in every small act of kindness, in the watchful glances exchanged by neighbors who now understood the weight of silence more than ever. The investigation had drawn to its end, but the lessons it left behind carried their own kind of permanence. People began to look at one another differently, not with suspicion, but with an awareness that no one truly knows the burdens the person next to them might be carrying. The officers who had once walked past each other with little more than a nod now lingered a moment longer, sharing words they used to keep to themselves, and in those moments, trust slowly rebuilt itself. The story of the investigation became one told in fragments, some through official statements, others in quiet conversations over late-night coffee or in the glow of a back porch light. The man at the center of it all was no longer just a figure on a report or a name whispered with unease. He had become a reminder of how deeply fear and desperation can shape choices, how easily someone can lose their footing when they feel the world has turned its back on them. People reflected on how quickly judgment had been cast, how fast whispers turned into walls. And in those reflections, the town found something close to healing. It wasn't the kind of healing that comes from forgetting. It was the kind that comes from finally seeing. Rebecca, who had carried the investigation with an unwavering grip even as it threatened to unravel her own sense of peace, finally took a moment for herself. She stood near the water's edge one late evening, the same place where clues had first begun to surface, and felt a calm that had been absent for too long. She thought about the long nights, the tense exchanges, the moments where truth felt like a thread always just out of reach. The case was over, but the responsibility it carried would not disappear so easily. She had learned more than she expected, not just about the people involved, but about how fragile trust is and how vital it is to protect. Navarro walked a few paces behind her, silent for a long time before he finally spoke. "You think they'll really change? That this will mean something a year from now?" His voice wasn't skeptical, just weary. Rebecca didn't turn around. "I think they already have," she said simply. "Change isn't loud. It starts quiet." He nodded, letting the words sit between them like the calm water that mirrored the fading light. For a moment, there was no weight of titles, no edge of rank or protocol. Just two people who had seen too much and still wanted to believe that what they did mattered. Across town, the families who had been pulled into the center of the storm were beginning their own kind of rebuilding. Doors that had been shut for months opened again. Children played in the yards where no one had dared to linger, and neighbors offered small gestures, a meal, a ride, a few words of support that had been missing before. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't immediate, but it was real. The fear that had gripped the town didn't vanish overnight, but it loosened, and in its place grew a quieter strength, one born from having endured something that could have easily torn them apart. The chief, who had spent months under scrutiny, didn't return to his position. He chose to step away, a decision that surprised some and relieved others. In his place came someone new, not with promises of sweeping change, but with a vow to listen, to be present, and to rebuild the bridge that had nearly been lost. It was a reminder that leadership wasn't always about power or command. It was about showing up, even when the easy choice was to step back. The department began small reforms, not the kind that make headlines, but the kind that keep doors open and ears ready. For the town, the key takeaway was something deeper than just the outcome of an investigation. It was about the value of paying attention, of asking the right questions, even when it's uncomfortable, and of standing beside one another when the air is thick with uncertainty. It was a lesson that even in the most ordinary places, conflict can take root in silence, and resolution often comes not from a single dramatic act, but from many small ones. Honest conversations, accountability, and the willingness to confront the shadows no one wants to look at. As the weeks turned into months, the story faded from the headlines, but not from memory. People remembered how it felt to stand on edge, waiting for answers that seemed always a day too far. They remembered the turning points, the revelations that felt like thunder cracking a heavy sky. And more importantly, they remembered the quiet moments after, the choice to forgive, the decision to stay, the realization that moving forward is never about erasing what happened, but carrying it with a lighter step. Rebecca and Navarro parted ways at the end of it, each moving on to other assignments, but they stayed in touch. Not because they shared a case, but because they shared a story that had changed them both in ways they couldn't fully explain. Sometimes the work is just that, work, but sometimes it reaches into places you didn't expect and leaves you different, quieter, more deliberate about what you protect. And that was enough. The town never fully returned to what it was before, but maybe it wasn't supposed to. There was a new kind of awareness now, a sense that everyone had a role in keeping the peace, not just those who wore a badge. It was fragile, yes, but it was something they built themselves, not handed down, not enforced, but chosen. And in that choice lay the strength that would carry them forward. This was not a story about villains and heroes, though some might try to call it that. It was a story about people, flawed, determined, scared, and brave in uneven measure. People who made mistakes and people who faced them. In the end, the resolution wasn't about who won or lost, but about who stayed when the air cleared, who looked at the cracks and decided they were worth mending. It was about a town that had been tested and, despite everything, chose to find its balance again.